Linear algebra is a major tool, not just in animation, but in all the sciences, really. It's almost like if there's a problem that you can solve, it's because it can be reduced to linear algebra. Anything that isn't linear, you end up having to approximate with linear steps. And so just about anything you can solve ends up being formulated as linear algebra. The surfaces used to create our characters, the faces, the hands, their bodies, had to be built out of basically deformed planes. So Buzz Lightyear, for instance, his face is built up by taking a deformed plane to represent the bulk of most of his face. But then there's another deformed plane that's kind of shaped into his nose and stuck into his face, and other deformed planes that are stuck into the head. Even his mouth was made out of two pieces of deformed planes, one for the lower jaw and one for the upper jaw. And the problem is that if you're just dealing with deformed planes and sticking them into one another, you get all these hard creases that the director may or may not like. You also get seams between those pieces, and it takes a huge amount of skill on the part of the artist to try to hide those seams. Whereas in Subdivision, they're just naturally first order continuous. So there aren't any seams, you don't have to do any work at all. The mathematics does the work for you. Yeah, so we use Subdivision to represent surfaces of complex shapes. So think of the face of one of our characters, for instance. And before we talk about those surfaces in three-dimensional space, it's a little easier to talk about how to make a smooth two-dimensional shape. So let's think about, say, how to make a smooth curve in 2 dimensions. And the way Subdivision works is you start out with a very crude shape, maybe even just a 4-point polygon. And you create a smooth object by repeatedly doing a couple of simple steps. The first step is called split, and that's where you add midpoints to edges. So that's a really, really easy computation. And the second step is called average, where you reposition all those points, again, say using midpoints. And after one stage of splitting and averaging, you can go from, say, 4 points to 8 points, and that's a little smoother. You do it again, you go from 8 points to 16 points, that's smoother still. And mathematically speaking, we do it an infinite number of times. And in the limit, then those polygons, those subdivided polygons, converge to something that, if you're careful, is smooth. And that same idea of splitting and averaging repeatedly also works for surfaces. So just about every surface you see these days is built using Subdivision. Main branches of linear algebra that come to bear in Subdivision, there are a lot of matrices and matrix multiplications. And there's also a really interesting use of eigenanalysis, eigenvectors and eigenvalues. Today, we've developed enough technology that's really freed our directors to just imagine whatever story they want to imagine. A lot of the technology we've already got. Many of our films, the stories that the directors come up with require us to develop new technology. But for the most part these days, the directors are really free to dream up whatever story they want, and one way or another we'll figure out how to get on screen. But what we try to do in the research group is look broadly across all of the existing productions, but for technology needs that might be peculiar to those films. But we also try to pay attention to those persistent unsolved problems that may have been with us for quite a while. And we create lists of opportunities and potential problems to work on, and then collectively we decide which ones we're going to attack at a given time. And so we generally try to have a mix between projects that can be developed and delivered on a relatively short time scale, maybe 3 to 6 months. But also in the mix, we want to have some of those bigger, harder problems that may take us 3 to 5 years to solve. Well, 2 of the big problem areas that we're working on, one is to make all of our computations go in real time. And that turns out to be a big challenge in a few areas. One area is in lighting. That's where we take the positions of all the virtual light sources in our virtual environments, bouncing off our virtual characters, and we try to simulate what's going to happen as light bounces around in that environment, ultimately back to the virtual camera. And what the virtual camera sees is what you see in the theater. Well, that's a lot of simulation, and it's an extremely time-consuming process. So we're working on methods now that'll make that go at 30 frames a second or faster instead of the 4 to 6 hours per frame that we're dealing with now. Another area where real-time computation is very difficult is in flesh and muscle simulation. That requires large-scale simulation of deformable volumes, whose motion are governed by stress and strain equations, Newton's laws of dynamics. We get very, very large linear systems that have to be solved. Typically it'll take minutes per sub-step, and we'd like that to go at real time as well. So the Uncanny Valley refers to situations where a digital character, typically a human, is kind of close to being human but doesn't really nail it. And the effect can come off as really creepy, probably because we've had millions or billions of years of evolution built into our visual system that lets us really analyze human faces and understand when things aren't quite right. So if you have a very stylized character, they're very believable and warm. Even something as simple as a line drawing, a smiley face is maybe the best example where it's appealing and it's very stylized. On the other hand, if you get everything right, then you can create an image that's indistinguishable from a real human. But that's really difficult. So typically what happens is people get close and they fall into the Uncanny Valley because they're not close enough. At Pixar, we've always been about stylization and appeal, and I don't expect that to change. The level of stylization, the particular details of the stylization, are largely up to the directors, but we find that storytelling with stylized characters can give a heightened sense of realism and entertainment than purely photorealistic. One nice thing about computer animation, computer graphics is it's as much art as it is science. And so in addition to learning all the underlying technical information, you can really develop your eye and your storytelling ability as an artist. The best thing to do is just get your hands dirty. Get your hands on Blender, for instance, which is an open source, free software package that does just about every part of the movie production process. So you can download Blender, work through the tutorials, make your own digital films.